50 boats slammed into my gate the night the HOA tried turning my lake into their gold mine. What would you do if an HOA built a luxury floating restaurant on your lake, charged your neighbors to fish, and tried stealing your family's boat ramp? I'm the guy who shut down their entire empire with one steel gate and a stack of deeds they hoped I'd never find. Stay with me, because this one turns fast, gets ugly, and ends with a twist nobody on that lake ever saw coming. If you want more real stories where land, law, and quiet justice win in the end, go on and hit subscribe. The sun was dropping behind the Wyoming ridgeline when the trouble finally broke loose. That soft orange glow, the one that usually turns my lake into a sheet of hammered copper, was swallowed by the racket of 50 different boat engines fighting for space in a bottleneck they never saw coming. The water below them churned in confused circles, boat wakes slapping against one another as if the whole lake had forgotten how to breathe. High-end pontoon boats, glossy ski boats, a couple of rental yachts from Jackson, every one of them packed with diners dressed in their finest resort clothing, spun in the narrow channel in front of my ramp. Their polished silverware clattered on tables as the floating restaurant behind them blasted music loud enough to shake the windows of my cabin. Lights from the platform flashed like a carnival barge drifting where it didn't belong. The only ramp these people could use, the only way any of them could get off the water, was locked tight. A steel and concrete hydraulic gate sunk 4 feet into the ground and strong enough to stop a truck. And I was the one holding the remote. Someone on a catamaran shouted, "Hey, who shut the ramp?" Another man waved a reservation slip in the air, as if the paper could magically part steel. A woman in a fur-lined coat yelled something about calling her lawyer, though I doubted she had cell service this far back in the mountains. The lake carried every sound clean across the surface, grievances, curses, arguments. They echoed off the pines like the forest itself was tired of listening. But the loudest voice, the one slicing through the rest like a chainsaw, belonged to Bethany Reed. She came tearing out from the floating restaurant on a sleek HOA-owned jet ski, blonde ponytail snapping behind her like a horsewhip. She didn't even bother slowing as she carved across the water, sending cold spray bursting into the air. When she reached the shoreline, she killed the engine and stood tall, hands planted on her hips, like she was about to personally evict the mountains. "Remy Cole!" she shrieked across the lake road. "You can't do this! You're destroying my business!" The words cracked through the cold September air. Her voice carried so cleanly that even the osprey perched on the tall, dead pine behind my cabin lifted its head. I stepped out from the porch, letting the evening breeze tug at my flannel shirt. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't sneaking around. I wanted her to see me. Wanted her to see that I wasn't backing down this time. The gate behind me sat solid and silent, its steel surface catching the last of the day's light. "Evening, Bethany," I called back, calm as the lake used to be. "Looks like you've got a traffic jam." She pointed at me like she was calling down judgment. "You locked the only launch ramp. People can't dock. They can't leave. Do you have any idea how much money you've cost me tonight?" The crowd behind her wasn't helping her case. From the boats came a chorus of irritated shouts. "How long is this going to take? My kid has school tomorrow. This is ridiculous. Just open the gate." I watched the scene quietly, the same way my father used to watch storms roll in. Calm, patient, certain of the outcome. I let Bethany rant, because the wind carried her anger away just as fast as she threw it. She jabbed her finger toward the ramp again. "This is community property. You can't just close it because you feel like it." That was the moment I felt something inside me settle, something solid, old, and carved deeper than anger. I stepped closer to the gravel edge of the road, letting the wooden planks under my boots creak, the smell of lake water drifting up like memory. "Bethany," I said, "that ramp isn't community anything." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you start with your old man stories again. It's my family's land, I continued. Every inch of it. And I have every right to lock it whenever I please. Her face went red, then white, then something between the two, like paint cracking on a tin sign left out too long in the sun. Behind her, several boaters pulled out their phones, recording. A few even started cheering. She tried again, louder, as if sheer volume could make her right. You're breaking HOA bylaws. You're violating community access. I held up the small remote in my hand. Black, simple, about the size of a key fob. The red indicator light glowed steadily, waiting for my next command. 50 boats rocked in the water behind her like a single nervous creature. You knew this day was coming, I told her. You just didn't know when. For a moment, the whole lake went still. Even the music from the restaurant paused between tracks, leaving only the soft push of the wind across the water and the distant call of a loon deeper in the cove. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Bethany took a half step forward, her voice trembling with fury. You're going to regret this, Remy. I swear. Maybe I was supposed to feel threatened. Maybe that's what she counted on. Fear, pressure, compliance. But instead, I felt something else entirely. Relief. Because this wasn't the beginning of a fight. It was the end of one. A few boaters revved their engines impatiently. One shouted, Hey, what's going on? Who's in charge here? I answered without looking away from Bethany. I am. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of diesel and spilled wine across the water. The orange glow on the horizon faded into the deep blue of approaching night. I glanced at the 50 boats swirling helplessly in front of the locked ramp, then back at the woman who'd pushed this lake and this community too far. So, I said quietly, you want to know how we got here? I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle over her, over all of them. Let me back up. The wind shifted across the lake, softer now, carrying the familiar scent of cold water and pine sap, the smell of my childhood. If you stand on my porch long enough at dusk, you can almost hear time itself settle into the timber walls. That lake has held stories longer than most folks in this county have been alive. And long before floating restaurants and HOA meetings and tourist boats, it held mine. I grew up on this land. My father, Daniel Cole, was a water infrastructure engineer back when half the state still relied on hand-dug irrigation ditches. He wasn't the type who talked much, but every word he spoke was anchored like bedrock. He used to tell me, a lake is only as honest as the people who care for it. I didn't understand it then, not fully. I do now. He built our first dock with his own hands in the summer of '64. The water was lower back then, the edges of the lake lined with taller reeds. I remember standing there barefoot as a kid, toes numb from the cold shallows, while he hammered those thick cedar planks into place. Every strike of the mallet echoed across the basin like the lake was answering him. When he finished, he carved our family initials, DC and RC, into the post nearest the waterline. That scar in the wood is still there if you know where to look. The deed he filed that same year was as careful as the man himself, detailed, airtight, and handwritten in the margins with notes in his blocky engineer's script. It wasn't just land on paper. It was lakebed rights, access rights, 60 feet of riparian ownership stretching out from shore. He knew the value of water before anyone else around here did. Knew that someday someone would try to take it. So he wrote every word like a shield. 3 generations learned to fish off that lake. My grandfather before him, me, and eventually my nieces and nephews. Early mornings with coffee steaming in the cold air. Trout breaking the surface like silver sparks. Loons calling across the fog. Quiet, steady, predictable in the best way. It stayed that way until about 18 months ago. That was when she arrived. Bethany Reed. fresh out of California with a designer suitcase in one hand and a real estate brochure in the other. The moment she stepped out of that spotless white SUV during the open house tour, something shifted in the air. Folks around here can smell trouble before they see it, and Bethany smelled like perfume, politics, and problems. Within 6 weeks, she'd joined the HOA. Within 3 months, she'd run for president. And within 3 months and 1 day, she started acting like she owned the entire lakeshore. It began with the little things, complaints that fishermen were ruining the aesthetic of the waterline, demands that neighbors submit landscaping plans for approval, notes left on doorsteps about non-compliant porch colors. I brushed most of it off. A person like that usually burns out or moves on, but Bethany wasn't looking to burn out. She was looking to build an empire. The first real blow landed last spring. I'd just finished oiling the boards on my father's dock when I noticed a laminated sign staked right at the edge of the trail. Shared community access. All lakefront entrances subject to HOA use and oversight. The wording was corporate, cold, aimed straight at me. Then she showed up in person, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was delivering gospel. "Remy," she said with that smile of hers. Tight, professional, practiced. "The board has agreed that your ramp is considered community property now. We want to ensure fair access for everyone." "My ramp?" I asked, wiping cedar oil from my hands. "Yes," she said. "The one you call your father's. The HOA believes the community has used it long enough to establish shared rights." I remember the exact way the light hit the water behind her. Sharp, like a warning. "That ramp was built in '64, I said. "By my father. On my land." "It's been used by everyone for decades," she insisted. "And under HOA bylaws," I cut her off. "Bylaws don't outrank Wyoming property law." Her smile flickered, a hairline crack in the foundation. She tried again. "Let's not make this contentious. We want harmony in this neighborhood." Harmony. That was her word, always. Usually said right before she did something that tore harmony to shreds. I walked back to my cabin, pulled out the deed my father left me, and laid it flat on the table. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but every measurement was as clear as a sunrise. The ramp, the dock, the 60 feet of lake bed reaching outward like a protective embrace. The HOA didn't own an inch of it. But Bethany? She didn't care about boundaries. Not physical ones, not moral ones, not legal ones. And a few weeks later, after the fishing ban near her property, after the sudden beautification fees, after the HOA newsletter announced a new lake improvement initiative, she made her move. She declared the ramp hers. She put it in writing. And she told me to my face, "This lake is changing, Remy. You can't cling to the past forever." I didn't say anything then. Didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. My father always said there are 2 ways to win a fight. With anger or with patience. Patience lasts longer. But while the spring melted into summer and tourists began pouring in, she kept pushing. Every week another rule, another fee, another attempt to erase what my family built. People whispered about her at the feed store, at the diner, at Sunday service. But most folks figured it would blow over. It didn't. Because Bethany wasn't just taking control. She was planning something. Something big. Something shiny. Something she said would transform the lake forever. And I didn't know it then, but that something would float, glow, pollute, and nearly tear this community in half. A floating empire. Her empire. The signs of it were everywhere if you knew how to look. Survey flags appearing near the shoreline. Trucks idling on the far road. Men measuring distance across the water. And when I finally realized what she was building out there, what she planned to anchor in the middle of my father's lake, I knew the silence wouldn't last much longer. Cliffhanger or not, war was coming. And she started it. The first real sign arrived on a Monday morning in late June, when the usual quiet hum of the lake was replaced by the deep-throated growl of diesel engines rolling down the gravel road. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and watched a convoy of trucks crawl along the lakeshore like a line of steel beetles, flatbeds loaded with metal beams, generators, and a crane large enough to lift a cabin off its foundation. Dust billowed behind them, drifting lazily through shafts of early sun. They didn't stop at the community dock. They didn't stop at the HOA common area. They came straight for the water directly across from my cabin. That told me everything. The first truck backed right up to the water line, crunching the gravel until it sank deep under the weight. Workers wearing reflective vests jumped out, unrolling blueprints on the hood like they were about to construct the next Hoover Dam. I walked down the path, each step making the boards of my father's dock creak the way they always had when the world was still sane. "What's happening here?" I asked. One of the workers glanced over his shoulder. "Floating restaurant installation," he said casually, as if dropping a neon barge into a wilderness lake was the most normal thing in the world. "Blackstone water dining, expedited project." Expedited. That word hit me like a cold wave. Bethany hadn't wasted a minute. By noon, the lake looked like a construction zone, diesel fumes hanging low, the clean mountain air turning sour. The workers hammered metal plates together, the sound carrying across the water like a wrecking crew. Birds lifted from the trees and flew inland. Even the water seemed to recoil, ripple patterns tightening around the anchored beams. I watched from the dock, hands braced on the old cedar railing my father had reinforced 30 years ago. He used to say you can judge a person's respect for nature by whether they show up with a canoe or a crane. Bethany didn't show up with either. She arrived in a polished white SUV, the kind with headlights that look like they glare at you. She stepped out dressed in a bright blazer and wedge heels, impractical for shorelines, perfect for pretending she was in charge. Her expression lit up when she saw the half-constructed platform floating out in the cove. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said to me, walking with that stiff, confident stride she practiced in mirrors. "It'll be the crown jewel of the lake. High-end dining, wine pairings, valet docking. It's exactly what this area needs." "What the lake needs," I said quietly, "is peace." She waved that off like a mosquito. "Progress requires vision, Remy. You'll thank me when property values rise." I looked at the barge, 30 feet of steel beams, plywood flooring, and the beginnings of a neon sign lying in crates nearby. "You can't build that here," I said, "not in the middle of a natural water body without proper authorization." Her smile tightened. "The HOA board approved it." "The HOA doesn't own the lake." "Close enough," she said, turning toward the workers. "If you have a complaint, take it up at the next meeting." I didn't respond. I didn't raise my voice. I walked back to my cabin and pulled out the yellowed deed again, smoothing the creases with the palm of my hand. The ink might have faded, but the lines were clear as the mountain horizon. My father's handwriting, clean, precise, outlined everything. The dock, the ramp, the property line stretching across the shoreline like a protective arm. That restaurant platform, if they anchored it where the survey flags were planted, would float over the first 15 feet of our riparian rights zone. My underwater land. By the end of the week, the monstrosity was nearly complete. The restaurant's frame hovered over the water like a metal predator, casting shadows across my father's dock. Light construction debris drifted onto my shoreline. Plastic wrapping, screws, food wrappers from the workers' lunches. I picked them up each evening, muttering under my breath, because cleaning the lake shouldn't have fallen on the man no one listened to. The worst part wasn't the noise. It was the view. For 30 years, I'd opened my front door and looked out at a glass-smooth lake reflecting nothing but sky, pine, and the outline of distant peaks. Now, when the sun set, The water glowed with sickly reflections of half-built neon letters from the restaurant sign. One morning, while I skimmed debris from the water with an old net, Jake Mercer, carpenter and neighbor for 20 years, walked over, his boots thudding softly on the damp soil. "You seeing this?" he asked, nodding at the floating platform. "Looks like a Vegas barge mated with a county fair booth." I snorted. My father would have had a stroke. Jake leaned on the dock rail, shaking his head. "She's pushing everyone, Remy. You're just the first in her crosshairs." "She thinks she owns the lake," I said. "She thinks she owns everything," Jake corrected. "But she's making enemies fast." As if on cue, a high-pitched beep echoed from across the cove. Workers were installing the metal posts for boat mooring, exactly where my nieces used to sit and spot trout in the clear water. Jake let out a long breath. "She didn't ask about permits, did she?" "No," I said. "Then you've got her," he whispered. I knew what he meant. An HOA can bully. An HOA can pressure. An HOA can pretend. But an HOA cannot build a commercial structure on a lake without the state's environmental blessing. Not legally. Not even close. I wiped my hands on my jeans, staring at the floating platform that seemed to grow larger every day. Metal ribs like a giant skeleton rising from the waterline. What else was she hiding? Jake looked at me sideways. "You're gonna fight her, aren't you?" I didn't answer at first. I watched a crane lift a prefabricated wall panel into place, watched the barge shift under the weight, watched the sunlight dim against the widening shadow over my dock. Then I nodded, slow and deliberate. "When the time's right," I said, "I'm going to remind her whose lake this is." And as the crane lowered the restaurant wall into place, it felt like the lake itself let out a long, tired sigh. The tension was building. Something was going to break. And I intended to make sure it wasn't this lake. What else was she hiding? I was about to find out. The first crack in her perfect empire didn't come from a courtroom or a sheriff's cruiser. It came from something simpler: paper. Most folks don't realize how loud paper can be when it's the right kind. How it can shout through the quiet the same way a hammer does on steel. And on a Wednesday morning thick with fog, I heard it loud and clear. I drove into town just after sunrise, the lake still wrapped in a cold, white blanket. My truck tires crunched over gravel that glistened with dew, leaving the floating restaurant behind me, its metal skeleton now towering like a misplaced lighthouse. I made my way to the county administration building in town, a squat brick place that always smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon cleaner. The clerk at the front desk, Dana, had known my family for years. She didn't even ask why I was there. She just sighed, pushed her glasses up her nose and said, "HOA trouble." "Something like that," I said. I asked for public records, building permits, waterway use permits, environmental impact forms, anything tied to the sudden invasion sprouting on my lake. Donna typed slowly, her fingers tapping the keys in a rhythm I'd heard since I was a teenager. Then she frowned. "That's strange," she murmured. "What is?" "There's nothing here." "Nothing for the restaurant?" "Nothing at all. No permits filed under HOA, Blackstone Dining, Bethany Reed. Nothing." I leaned forward. "Check construction exemptions." She did. "Nothing." I swallowed a cold breath. "Environmental impact?" She clicked again. "Nothing. No form. No study. No mandatory review. Not even a preliminary assessment request." "Dana," I said quietly, "they're building a commercial platform over natural water. It's required by law." She nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "And if they don't have it, the state can shut them down instantly." Those words struck the same way the first snowfall hits a cold roof, silent, heavy, consequential. I thanked her and stepped into the hallway, where the walls were lined with old framed maps of the valley. I traced a fingertip along the outline of the lake, my lake, feeling the weight of everything my father had protected. I wasn't done, though. Paper leads to more paper. I took the elevator to the basement, where they stored older records. The air smelled like aging ink and dust. A fan hummed in the corner with a lazy wobble. Under flickering fluorescent lights, I opened drawer after drawer, searching for anything that tied Bethany's project to the county. But instead of finding a trail, I found a void. No listings, no applications, no hearings. No. Just a gaping silence where paperwork should have been stacked like a firewall. That's when it clicked. Bethany wasn't just cutting corners. She wasn't following the process at all. She was building illegally. Back at home, when I spread my father's old survey maps across the dining table, these were drawn in the 60s, but his accuracy was the kind engineers envy. He'd measured every tree line, every contour, every stretch of underwater slope. I compared them to the modern GPS maps pinned to my corkboard. The alignment was dead on. Then I saw it. The restaurant's anchor points, 4 thick steel pylons drilled into the lakebed, were at least 15 feet inside my riparian boundary. It wasn't guesswork. It wasn't a maybe. The angles matched exactly. They were drilling anchors into my underwater property. Late that afternoon, I drove to Sarah Mitchell's small office on Main Street. She wasn't just a land use attorney. She was the kind of person who didn't smile unless it mattered. A friend of my sister's, smart, direct, fair. Her office smelled like old books and fresh cedar from the shelves her husband built. She flipped through the records I'd brought. Photos of the anchor installation, GPS coordinates, the deed, survey maps. Her brow tightened. "When did you take these?" she asked. "2 days ago," I said. She tapped the photo with her pen. "Remy, these anchors are on your lakebed." "I know. And they filed no permits?" "I checked everything. They filed nothing." She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. "Then this isn't an HOA problem. This is a legal problem. Commercial trespass, unpermitted construction on natural water, environmental violations, and potentially fraud if they misrepresented anything to the board." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a sense of solid ground forming under my feet. "Can we stop it?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "Not yet, but we can build a case so clean it'll slice through whatever she thinks she's doing." Outside her office window, the wind swept dust across the road in thin spirals. A stray wrapper tumbled past like it was running from something. Maybe it was. By the time I got home, the sun was low and the restaurant shell gleamed gold, floating like a gaudy jewel no one asked for. The workers were gone for the day, leaving behind the hum of generators and the faint thud of metal settling in the rising chill. Standing at the edge of the lake, I watched the barge bob slowly in the evening current. The water rippled around the anchor pylons, those long, illegal limbs reaching into my father's lake like they belonged there. But they didn't. And for the first time since the HOA started pushing, I felt something new settle into me. An emotion older than anger, steadier than fear. Resolve. If Bethany was willing to skip permits, what else had she faked? The lake and I had the same question, and the answers were waiting. It started the next morning, long before the sun crested the ridge. The air was still, the water dark as iron, and the floating restaurant's outline loomed like some misplaced shipwreck waiting to be dragged under. I stood on my dock with a thermos of coffee, letting the bitterness ground me while the first hints of dawn painted the sky in thin streaks of blue. I didn't have to wait long for the day's first reminder that the lake was changing, and not for the better. Around 6, an old pickup rumbled down the narrow road toward the ramp. I recognized the rusty fender and mismatched headlights before the driver even stepped out. It was Frank Turner, 50 years of fishing calluses on his hands, and a voice that could still carry across the water without trying. His grandson, Leo, a kid barely 10, hopped out behind him with a fishing rod almost as tall as he was. Morning meant fishing. Always had. Always should've. But this morning wasn't like the others. A shiny new sandwich board sign had been planted right at the trailhead. HOA access fee, $25. Daily fishing permit required. Frank froze when he saw it. Since when does a man have to pay to stand on water his father fished? He muttered. His voice cracked at the edges, not angry, hurt. That's worse. Before I could walk over, a security guard in a crisp navy jacket stepped out from behind the community bulletin board. The badge on his chest wasn't county issued. It was private. Purchased power. Ramps closed without a permit, he said, tapping the sign like it was scripture. Frank pushed his cap back. Son, I've been fishing this lake longer than you've been shaving. I don't need a permit to bring my grandson out. The guard shrugged, bored. HOA rules. You'll have to pay. Leo clutched his fishing rod tighter, looking up at his grandfather with big, confused eyes. Grandpa, I thought it was free. I stepped forward, but before I could speak, Frank gripped Leo's shoulder gently. It is free, he whispered, just not to them. He gave me a nod, a sad, tired nod, then turned back toward his truck. The kid didn't understand, but he would someday. The next blow landed that afternoon. A woman I knew well, Mrs. Petrosky, who'd lived here longer than anyone, pulled into my driveway with trembling hands on the steering wheel. Her husband had passed 2 months earlier after a long illness. She came every anniversary of their first date to scatter a few flower petals on the lake, where they'd danced barefoot on the dock as teenagers. But today, her eyes were red. Remy, they wouldn't let me down there, she said, voice quivering. They told me I had to pay. To scatter petals. On the dock where Henry proposed to me. Her voice cracked as she looked toward the water. They told me memories don't make exceptions. A cold wind moved across the lake then, like even the pines were ashamed. I walked her to the dock myself, my dock, and let her have her piece. No guard, no fee, just the sound of soft petals settling on the water like small, quiet goodbyes. When she left, she squeezed my hand. Your father would have fought this, she whispered. I knew she was right. By Thursday, the community was whispering everywhere, from the grocery line at Miller's Market to the pews at Sunday service. Folks shared stories about denied access, fines, warnings, surveillance cameras popping up like mushrooms after rain, all spearheaded by the same polished smile and cold ambition, Bethany Reed. But then came the moment that lit the fuse. I was picking up supplies at Chuck's Cafe when Sheriff Marcus Hale walked in, dusty uniform and all. He leaned against the counter and spoke low, like the walls themselves were listening. I heard what happened with Frank, he said. Word travels. It does. And so does trouble. Marcus took a slow breath. Look, Remy. She's stepping on the wrong toes. Charging access fees without a county permit? Denying long-standing public custom? She thinks a title from an HOA gives her the power of a badge. It doesn't. No, he said firmly. But some folks don't know the difference. He placed a hand on my shoulder and lowered his voice even further. If you hit her, Remy, hit clean. Don't give her anything she can twist. I nodded. I'm not looking for a fight. He smirked. Oh, I think she already brought you one. On the way home, I drove slow, watching the lake shimmer through breaks in the trees. The floating restaurant stood finished now, polished wood siding, wide deck rails, lights strung across the top like a wedding venue. It glowed like artificial promise. But I wasn't looking at the building. I was looking at the anchors. Those steel legs drilled straight into my lake bed. When I got home, I spread everything across my kitchen table: deeds, survey maps, photos, environmental regulations printed straight from the state's website. I worked through the quiet hours of the night, the hum of the refrigerator, the only companion. At some point, I realized the lake outside had gone still as glass, and so had I. Finally, sometime after midnight, I closed the last folder and leaned back in my chair. Two things were crystal clear. Bethany thought she owned the lake. She didn't know how wrong she was, but if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that truth doesn't matter unless it's delivered with weight and timing. The lake needed a counterweight. My community needed a reminder, and Bethany needed a lesson. By dawn, I had a plan. A clean one, a legal one, a devastating one. The trap needed one final piece, and I knew exactly where to find it. Early the next morning, before the lake fully shrugged off its fog, I headed toward Billings in my old Ford. The sky was washed in pale morning light, the kind that makes the road look endless, and the mountains feel like they're leaning in to listen. I drove with the windows cracked, just enough to pull in the cold air. Pine-scented, sharp, honest. The kind of air that makes you feel like you can't lie to yourself, even if you try. The shop I was looking for sat on the outskirts of town. A squat warehouse with a faded sign, Rocky Mountain Security Solutions. I'd heard of them through a rancher friend who needed something stubborn enough to outstubborn the people he was dealing with. That was exactly what I needed. As soon as I stepped inside, the smell of machine oil and sawdust settled around me. Men in work boots rolled heavy steel gates across the concrete floor, each one built like it wanted a fight. The owner, Jake Reeves, a former Marine with forearms like carved oak, strolled over, wiping grease from his hands. "You must be Cole," he said. Not a question. "Heard you were coming." "Word travels that fast?" I asked. He shrugged. "Small towns love a good fight. Who's the enemy?" "An HOA," I said simply. That pulled out a grin. "Ah, the toughest of them all." He walked me over to a massive hydraulic gate, thick as a bunker door and twice as mean-looking, solar-powered, reinforced steel bollards, tamper-proof housing, motion sensors, night cameras, rated for vehicles up to 12,000 pounds. "You planning on stopping a bear or a bulldozer?" he asked. "Something worse," I said. "A woman who thinks bylaws outrank land deeds." He nodded like he'd heard that line before. Too many times. Then he tapped the steel with his knuckle. "This one'll make her rethink her life choices." We went through the paperwork, straightforward, clean, done by the book. Because if Bethany wanted a legal battle, she was about to walk into one built from my father's values and my own training. Measure twice, build once, and make sure the thing stands long after the nonsense blows away. Jake scheduled installation for Friday afternoon. "She won't get through this gate with a tank," he said. "That's the idea," I replied. On my way back home, I stopped by Sarah Mitchell's office. The wind outside had picked up, stirring dust devils along Main Street. Her door chimed as I walked in. She glanced up from a stack of files. "You look like a man who found what he needed." "I did," I said, "and I need to stack the deck a little more." I laid everything on her desk: photos, surveys, the dredged-up county permit logs that showed nothing but empty lines where her restaurant claims should have been. Sarah sifted through it all, her eyes sharp. "You're ready," she said finally. "Everything you do now needs to be clean, professional, no shouting matches, no confrontations." "That's never been the issue," I said. "Good, because if she tries anything illegal," she tapped the papers, "I want these waiting in my back pocket." She drew up the cease and desist papers. A formal notice regarding trespass on my riparian property. Another regarding unpermitted commercial use of the lake. A third regarding the illegal seizure of my ramp as community property. Every line was precise. Every citation backed by Wyoming law. "This," she said, "is your insurance." Outside, the wind rattled the windows, almost as if the lake itself was asking how much longer it had to wait. Friday arrived with a sky as clear as glass and air sharp enough to sting your lungs. Jake Reeves and his crew showed up mid-afternoon in 2 flatbeds, engines rumbling like the start of a parade. I watched from the porch as they unloaded the thick steel bollards, each one coated in matte black paint that drank in the sun. They dug into the earth with machine precision, dust swirling around them in thick tan clouds. The clang of metal on rock echoed across the water. Even the floating restaurant paused in its construction as workers turned to stare. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and when the last screw was torqued down, Jake beckoned me over. The gate was a thing of beauty, if you find beauty in justice. Reinforced steel, hydraulic pistons, a control box locked tighter than a bank vault, solar panels angled like the wings of some mechanical bird ready to fly. Jake handed me a small remote, matte black, single red button. "Your ramp," he said, "is now the safest piece of property in Wyoming." I pressed the button. The gate rose smooth as a whisper. Pressed again. It lowered with the heavy, certain finality of truth being spoken aloud. "That'll hold," Jake said. "Against anything." I nodded. "Then we're done here." Marcus, who had wandered in to supervise, gave a low whistle. "Remy, that thing looks like it came off a military base." "Good," I said. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. Every inch of that gate better be legal." "It is," I said, "and I have the paperwork to prove it." He gave me a long look, then nodded once, satisfied. And then, like clockwork, the moment came. Saturday evening. Bethany's floating restaurant held its soft opening. Lights flickered across the water like carnival bulbs. Slick boats pulled up, fancy folks in dress shirts and silk scarves laughing into the night. And right as the first wave of customers headed toward the ramp, I pressed the button. The gate locked with a deep metallic thud. Engines sputtered. Boats idled in confusion. Voices rose. Wine sloshed in glasses. And across the lake, like a storm gathering strength, I saw her. Bethany Reed, striding toward the ramp like she intended to burn the whole mountain down. And she did exactly what I expected her to. She lost control. The moment Bethany saw the ramp gate sealed shut, its steel frame catching the glow of her restaurant's decorative lights, her posture snapped from polished HOA president to something closer to a cornered animal. She stormed across the gravel in heels that were never meant for mountain ground, each step kicking up dust that floated in the spotlight glow like ash. "Remy!" she screamed, voice cracking through the cold night. "Open this gate! You're ruining my business!" My porch light cast a warm halo behind me as I stood at the top of the steps. I didn't shout back. I didn't move. The only sound on my property was the faint clicking of the cooling metal on the gate and the restless hum of boat engines trapped behind her. They couldn't dock. They couldn't unload. And they all knew exactly who was responsible. She sprinted the last few steps to the ramp, grabbing the steel bars with both hands. The echo of metal rattling across the lake cut through the fancy restaurant music and startled some of the diners, who were already leaning over boat rails with half-eaten oysters and confused expressions. "You can't do this!" she shrieked again. "This is obstruction of commerce! I'll sue you myself!" "On what grounds?" I asked, voice steady and low. "This gate sits on my land, entirely." Her eyes flashed. "The ramp is community property." "No," I said. "It hasn't been since 1964. She yanked harder, as if brute force might undo 60 years of legal boundaries. When that failed, she kicked the lower bar with her heel. The sound reverberated through the metal, the lake, and probably through her bones. Behind her, the boaters were starting to panic. Ma'am, are we supposed to just sit here all night? I've got a baby on board. Do you have another exit? Hey, lady with the ponytail, are you in charge or not? A flare of embarrassment crossed her face. She turned and tried to shout directions to the boaters, but another loud clatter interrupted her. This time from the trail camera mounted 20 feet up the pines. Its little red recording light blinked steadily in the dark. She noticed and panicked. In a burst of rage, she picked up a handful of gravel and threw it toward my property. The stones skipped weakly across the ground. She grabbed the gate again and shook it with both hands, her breath fogging in the cold night air. Her composure, the one she paraded around at HOA meetings, was gone. This was the real face behind the manicured exterior. But the night wasn't over. Later, long after the trapped boats managed to turn around and limp back toward the HOA marina, my motion sensors chimed on my phone. It was 2:13 a.m., the kind of hour when even the lake goes silent. I opened the live camera feed. There she was again, Bethany Reed. This time not in luxury heels and a blazer. She wore black leggings, a windbreaker, and a look of pure desperation. And she wasn't alone. A man in a tool belt, someone she must have hired off the books, crouched near the base of the gate, holding heavy wire cutters that glinted under the camera's night vision. She was whispering urgently to him, pointing at the solar conduit and the control box mounted inside the steel casing. "Cut it," she hissed. "All of it. He can't shut us down again." The man hesitated. "This system's industrial, ma'am. That's high voltage. This ain't some backyard gate." "I am paying you," she snapped. "Just do it!" He reached out and snapped the cutters around the main cable. A small spark burst forth, bright as a firefly but sharp enough to make him yank his hand back. "Lady, this thing's got backup," he muttered. "You didn't tell me it was commercial grade." "It doesn't matter," she barked. "Try another line." They tried, again and again, and each time the sparks flew, but nothing powered down. The gate remained as solid and steady as the mountains behind it. I watched from my darkened porch, unseen. The camera captured everything. Her pacing, her cursing, her slamming her fists against the steel housing. The tool belt man finally stood up, shaking his head. "This is felony territory," he said. "I'm out." He walked off into the night, leaving her alone with her anger. Bethany turned to the lake, wild-eyed, and threw the cutters into the water. The splash echoed louder than it should have. She sank to her knees in the gravel, clutching her hair in both hands. Then she screamed. Not words, not accusations, just pure, frustrated sound. A sound that belonged to someone watching their empire crack open. The next morning, the sun rose pink and gold over the mountains, as if the lake wanted to pretend nothing happened. But the truth was written everywhere. On the disturbed gravel around the gate, on the severed wires still curled like scorched vines, and in the fresh tire tracks leading away from the scene. By noon, she'd gone on the offensive. A formal complaint to the sheriff claiming I'd harassed workers and threatened public safety. An emergency HOA meeting accusing me of sabotage. A letter slipped under my door stating I owed $2,500 in HOA violation penalties for interference with lake operations. I walked into the meeting that evening with a folder under my arm, thick with deeds, water rights documents, boundary maps, and, most importantly, high-resolution video clips. Her accusations died in her throat the second I set the folder on the table. "You want to talk about interference?" I asked. "Let's talk about what my cameras saw last night." Her face drained of color. "Remy, this is ridiculous. Is it?" I opened the first video. The sound of sparks filled the room. A few people gasped. Jake Mercer, sitting 3 rows back, let out a low whistle. Bethany covered her mouth with her hand. "This is illegal," someone muttered. "She tried to destroy private property." I closed the folder slowly, deliberately. The anchors of your restaurant platform, I said, are drilled into my lake bed. And now this. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for support. None came. The twist landed like a stone dropped into still water. Her entire restaurant, her pride, her project, her future, was sitting on illegal ground. And everyone in that room now knew it. Silence fell across the community hall like dust after a demolition blast. Slow, heavy, inescapable. 50 pairs of eyes shifted from the screen to Bethany, who stood frozen behind the podium, fingers gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. The grainy night vision footage of her midnight sabotage attempt flickered to an end, leaving only the soft hum of the projector. No one stood up for her. No one looked away from her. The room had turned into a jury she never expected. The old ceiling fans spun above us, stirring stale air that felt charged with something new, something sharp, like truth cutting through weeks of manipulation. Finally, Jake Mercer broke the silence. "Looks like she tried to blow the lock clean off," he said, shaking his head. "That's felony vandalism in my book." A few people nodded. Someone whispered, "That's more than vandalism." Bethany tried to regain control, clearing her throat and forcing a smile so thin it looked painful. "Folks," she said, "this is all being misinterpreted. Those videos are taken out of context. Mr. Cole has been hostile for months." I stepped forward before she could finish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room leaned toward me the way a forest leans toward a strong wind. "Let's put context back in," I said, setting another document on the table. "This is the deed my father signed in 1964. This," I unfolded the survey map, "is the riparian boundary. And these," I tapped the photos Sarah helped prepare, "are the anchor pylons of your floating restaurant, drilled 15 feet inside my underwater property." Gasps moved through the room like ripples on the lake. Sarah Mitchell, sitting to one side, stood up with a calm, professional air. She adjusted her glasses and spoke clearly, her voice steady as a courthouse bell. "Under Wyoming law," she said, "any physical structure placed on or anchored into privately owned lakebed constitutes commercial trespass. This restaurant is not just unpermitted. It is illegally occupying Mr. Cole's property." Murmurs rose again, louder this time. Angry, tired, fed-up murmurs. Bethany stiffened. "That is absurd. The HOA has full authority to manage shared spaces." "Shared spaces?" Mrs. Foster, who lived 2 cabins down, stood with shaking hands. "You charged me $25 just to launch my canoe so I could visit the cove my husband and I fished for 30 years. You turned our lake into a carnival," shouted a man from the back. "You said it'd be peaceful," yelled another. The hall, once quiet and orderly, erupted into voices overlapping, frustrations spilling over like water behind a broken dam. Bethany slammed the podium with her palm. "Enough! This meeting is under my authority, and I refuse to be ambushed by lies and fabrications." "Then explain the pollution," someone said. All eyes swung toward the speaker, Jake Mercer again. He walked up, placing a pile of printed photos on the table in front of her. Thick silt clouds in shallow water. Floating scraps near the shoreline. Diesel streaks rippling across the cove like bruises on the lake's skin. "These were taken last week," Jake growled. "That mess wasn't here until your restaurant barge showed up." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "And explain this," Mrs. Foster added, pulling a crumpled receipt from her pocket. "I was charged twice for the same launch fee, and threatened when I asked for a refund." I watched the color drain from Bethany's face, turning her crisp confidence into something brittle. But the night was far from over. Sarah laid out the final blow. The HOA cannot impose commercial fees without a county-approved access plan, financial review, and environmental compliance. There is no record of any such approval. The crowd erupted again, This time not into anger, but unity. The people who once trusted Bethany were done trusting. The people who once feared HOA retaliation now feared what she'd done in their name. And the people who thought I was overreacting now saw what I had seen from the start. Behind me, Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped forward from where he'd been leaning against the wall. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His presence alone sent a cold tremor down Bethany's spine. For the first time since she arrived in Wyoming, she looked small, cornered, exposed. She flicked her eyes at her board members, silently begging for support. But they all avoided her gaze. Even Carol, her right-hand rule enforcer, stared at the floor tiles as though they were suddenly fascinating. Finally, Bethany tried to salvage something. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said shakily. "The community voted for improvement. I'm doing what's best for property value and growth." A man in a denim jacket interrupted her. "Growth ain't worth losing our lake." Another woman shouted, "You made this mess, Bethany." A third person added, "We want a vote, right now." The room exploded with agreement. Hands raised, voices rose. People clapped, stomped, demanded leadership changes. Some even pulled out their phones, recording everything. The paperwork, the accusations, the evidence. Bethany's composure cracked completely. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted wildly, like she was searching for an escape. "You can't," she began. But she never finished. Sarah stepped beside me and quietly said, "She's about to make a desperate move." And Sarah was right, because in the frenzy of calls for a vote, demands for her resignation, and rising public anger, Bethany made one final gamble. She straightened, steadied her voice, and declared, "I will not step down. In fact, as HOA president, I hereby file an emergency motion to seize Mr. Cole's ramp and restrict his access until this investigation is concluded." The room fell silent, completely silent. Then someone whispered, "Oh no, she really doesn't get it." Because everyone knew the truth. She had just doubled down on illegal property seizure, and I had the documents ready. The trap was set, and she had walked right into the center of it. Bethany's voice still echoed off the wooden rafters of the community hall as she announced her emergency motion to seize my ramp. The absurdity of her words hung in the air, like smoke from a bad engine. Thick, choking, impossible to ignore. You could feel every pair of eyes turn to me. They weren't looking for a fight. They were waiting for the truth they finally knew existed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Evidence speaks louder than shouting ever could. I stepped forward, the pine floorboards creaking under my boots, and placed a thick manila folder on the podium, right where her trembling hands had been moments earlier. "Bethany," I said quietly, "you should have checked who really owns what before threatening to take anything." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I flipped open the folder. The papers inside caught the fluorescent lights overhead, their edges crisp and sharp, like a blade she never saw coming. "This," I said, pulling out a notarized deed from 1964, "is the original transfer of land and riparian rights to my father, Sam Cole. It includes the 60 feet of underwater property your restaurant is anchored on." Gasps, whispers. A woman clutched her husband's arm. I didn't stop. "And this," I placed the next stack down, "is your loan agreement for $420,000. Signed by you. Secured with HOA assets you had no legal authority to pledge. Community pool, clubhouse, tennis courts." The sound that rippled through the room wasn't shock. It was betrayal, raw and collective. Bethany's face paled to a color I'd only seen once before. The color of someone who realizes the ground beneath them isn't just unstable. It's gone. No, that's not," she began. Sarah stepped up beside me, cool as snowfall, and held up a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws. Section 9, she read calmly, states that no board member may leverage community property, funds, or collateral without a 75% approval vote from homeowners. She closed the booklet slowly. That vote never happened. Someone in the room muttered, "She lied to all of us." Another voice, "We trusted her." Sheriff Marcus Hale, who'd been leaning against the wall, finally stepped forward. His boots thumped on the hardwood like the beginning of a drum roll. I pulled out the final piece, a notarized affidavit from the county clerk. "Here's the kicker," I said. "Your loan is already in delinquency. Your floating restaurant, all its equipment, all its revenue, was supposed to make the payments. But your first payment bounced." Gasps again. Louder this time. "And since you used community assets as collateral," I added, "the bank is preparing foreclosure papers." Bethany staggered back like the words had weight. Her voice cracked. You're lying. This is all manipulated. This is harassment." Sheriff Hale's voice cut through the noise. "No, Bethany," he said. "This is investigation." He nodded toward a second officer standing by the exit. "Mrs. Reed, please step forward." The entire hall went silent, dead silent, except for the screen still glowing behind us, frozen on security footage of her attacking my gate with a boat trailer at 3 a.m. Bethany's hands shook. "You can't arrest me. You can't. I am the HOA president." Sheriff Hale took a step closer. "Not anymore." He pulled out a warrant, signed that afternoon. "For embezzlement of community funds, falsifying HOA financial records, attempted bribery of a county official, and destruction of private property." Her knees buckled. Her voice broke. She looked around wildly for someone, anyone, to defend her. No one moved. Not even Carol. Not even her own board. The handcuffs clicked into place with a cold, metallic finality that echoed off the rafters. The doors opened. The crowd parted. And Bethany Reed, the woman who tried to seize my lake, my ramp, my legacy, was led out beneath the glow of camera lights and murmured disbelief. Silence lingered long after the doors closed. People weren't clapping. Not yet. They were absorbing what they'd just seen. The truth. The fraud. The collapse of the empire she built on sand. Finally, someone whispered, "What happens to the lake now?" I looked out the window toward the water, the reflection of the floating restaurant flickering like a dying lantern. "The lake," I said softly, "will survive. But her restaurant won't." Behind me, Sarah placed a hand on the final stack of documents still on the table. The foreclosure notice, the environmental violation order, the trespass report, the cease and desist. Her voice was steady. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow, the cleanup begins." And she was right. Bethany's downfall was only the beginning. The lake still needed justice, and by sunrise, justice would finally arrive. The first light of morning stretched across the Wyoming peaks like a pale gold brushstroke, slow and soft, reminding the world that even after months of chaos, nature still kept its quiet rhythm. Mist drifted low over the lake's surface, curling around the floating restaurant's silhouette, now hollow, dim, and stripped of the arrogance it once carried. The air was crisp enough to sting the lungs, clean enough to wipe away the memory of diesel fumes. I stood on my dock with a cup of coffee warming my palms, feeling the old boards creak beneath me. My father had rebuilt this dock 3 times in his life. Once after a storm, once after rot, and once just to make it sturdier for the grandkids. This morning, for the first time in too long, the water around it rippled naturally, undisturbed by motors or the thump of generators. Down the shoreline, 2 trucks from the bank's asset recovery team eased into the gravel turnoff. Their engines rumbled low, steady, almost respectful. Men stepped out, adjusting gloves, hats pulled low against the cold, moving with the deliberate calm of folks used to ending mistakes built by people who thought rules didn't apply to them. "Morning, Mr. Cole," one of them called. "Morning," I answered, tipping my mug. They'd already reviewed the paperwork Sarah delivered: the foreclosure notice, environmental violation freeze, and trespass injunction. There was nothing left to argue, no appeal to wait for, no loophole for Bethany to reach for. The floating restaurant was officially a seized asset. One of the recovery guys clicked on a radio. "Team 1, bring the tow vessel in," he said. A minute later, a small tugboat rounded the bend, its diesel growl echoing across the water. Strong, clean, humble, the opposite of everything the floating restaurant represented. The tug nosed against the platform, cables thrown and secured with practiced motions. Metal clinked, ropes tightened, hydraulic engines hummed. A slow pull began, steady, unhurried. The platform shuddered as the force took hold, the water slapping against its pontoons like applause from the lake itself. I watched the structure drift, first a foot, then 2, then sliding, inch by inch, away from my property line, away from the center of my lake, away from the stain it left. For the first time since Bethany arrived, I heard loons again. Their calls echoed faintly, fragile but returning. Sarah joined me on the dock, her boots crunching over frosted wood. "Feels different already," she murmured. "Yeah," I said softly. "Feels like the lake exhaled." Behind us, neighbors began gathering, Chuck with his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, the foster kids rubbing sleep from their eyes, old Mr. Bennett leaning on his cane. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching as the floating restaurant, once Bethany Reed's pride, her empire, her weapon, was tugged across the lake like a carcass pulled from the woods. At the far end of the water, the tow crew would dismantle it plank by plank. The metal would be sold, the pontoons recycled, the greed that built it erased. Sheriff Marcus stepped beside me, arms folded, hat pulled low. "Bet you never thought you'd see this day," he said. "I hoped," I replied. "Didn't know if we'd get here." "You did everything by the book, Remy. That's why it held." I nodded. The wind picked up off the lake, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth, the smell of a place reclaiming itself. By noon, the barge disappeared behind the bend, leaving only a widening ripple in its wake. The lake lay unbroken again. The HOA collapse happened faster than anyone predicted. By the end of the week, the board had resigned. By the end of the month, neighbors voted, unanimously, to dissolve the HOA entirely. "We don't need rulers," said Betty Sterling, standing at the last meeting. "We need neighbors." And that was that. The next step was rebuilding. I spent the following weekends repairing the wooden dock my father built, sanding old boards, replacing cracked planks, tightening rusted bolts. Every task brought back echoes. Dad teaching me how to tie a slip knot, Mom handing him lemonade, my sisters daring each other to jump in early spring when the water was still ice cold. When I finished, kids lined up at the edge, fishing poles in hand, grinning like they'd discovered treasure. One of the older men clapped my shoulder. "Your dad would have liked this," he said. "He would," I whispered. 3 weeks later, the Sarah Cole Memorial Fishing Derby returned. 400 people showed up, families from towns across Wyoming, Montana, even Idaho. Boats drifted peacefully again. Coffee steamed from thermoses. Kids laughed. Grandparents told stories. For a moment, the lake held every generation in one gentle rhythm. Later, at the small ceremony, I looked up at the mountains and felt something settle in my chest. Quiet, steady, firm. This lake was whole again. This community was whole again. Spring came early that year. As the last snow melted, I opened Sarah's bait and tackle in the old marina building. Nothing fancy. White paint, wood counter, a bell above the door. Inside hung old photographs. Sarah holding a fish bigger than her arm. My dad waving from the dock. Us kids sitting on overturned buckets. The morning it opened, Chuck brought coffee. Betty brought cookies. Marcus dropped off a stack of pamphlets about local wildlife programs. Before noon, half the town wandered through, picking up lures, swapping stories, leaning on the counter like it belonged to them too. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Can we fish here, Mom?" She smiled. "We sure can." And they did. By early summer, the lake became a conservation education site. Kids cleaned shoreline litter. Rangers taught them about riparian zones. Teen volunteers restocked smallmouth bass. What had once been threatened became preserved. And every time I stood back watching, the land, the lake, the air all felt right. Like the fight had been worth it. One evening, as the sunset painted long streaks of fire across the water, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The lake was calm. The loons were calling. The air was clean. No generators, no neon signs, no HOA threats. Just the place my family built piece by piece, story by story. I exhaled slowly. All I wanted, I murmured to the empty porch, was to protect this lake. But as the soft wind picked up, rustling through the pines, I realized something else. Turns out, the whole community needed protecting too. And now? The lake breathed free again, the way it always should have. If you've ever stood your ground for what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments, so I know I'm not alone out here. And if stories about justice, land, and quiet strength speak to you, go on and hit subscribe. There's plenty more to tell.